So, let's dive in, shall we? Okay, so setting up automatic debug symbols. So for every build that we want, we need to upload the debug symbols to Sentry so that when we're running the app and the app crashes, we want Sentry to have those debug symbols so it can give us more info, right? So on Sentry's website, there is a script, and I'll show it to you now. We're gonna go to the project. We're gonna go to the targets right here, and then enter the build phases. There is a run script at the bottom right here. If it doesn't exist, I believe you can create a new run script phase, and that's exactly what we want. So this script, I just took it from Sentry's website, right? So that's this code sample here is from Sentry's website. I didn't actually write this because I'm not that sharp into, you know, shell scripting, but I did some modifications on it. And that is the first line right here. As you can see, we are sourcing some environment env.sh file, and that file actually contains the name of our Sentry organization, the name of our project, sorry, and the authentication token. So Sentry script, the Sentry CLI upload diff needs the authentication token so it can upload, you know, the upload the dsym files securely. So if we look at the env files on the left right here, I'm going to open the sample file because my original env contains the keys. It's a very simple one. We just have 3 variables defined, right? We have the Sentry organization, we have the Sentry project, and we have the Sentry authentication token. And that's it. These used to be here. So we had like export Sentry_org, and then we had these here. But this script is tracked from the source control. So you don't want to keep your authentication key here, right? The authentication token, because that means your Sentry account is now mine, right? So we don't want that to happen. That's why I needed to isolate, or like to separate these 3 environment variables: the organization, the project, and the authentication, especially the authentication project. I wanted to separate them into different files so that I can ignore that file. I can add it to my git ignore file so it doesn't get pushed to the repo, right? But it still works because we are sourcing that file, right? So for example, our environment file is right here in the goodbye money folder, right? So we just do source, then we do the source root variable here. This is a known variable in Xcode. That means it's pointing directly to the in our case goodbye money project, right? Then we enter the goodbye money folder, and then we source the env.sh file. And that is exactly like we had this export Sentry_org, right? So in order to push the run script that uploads the debug symbols, I needed to isolate the actual files. And the env.sample is actually not part of the git ignore. So if you were to download, or like to clone this repo and clone it locally, you would still see the env.sample. And that's pretty important, because if you want to set this project up on your local machine, you need to know which environment variables you need to provide in order for, you know, this project to work with your Sentry account. So that's why I'm leaving the .sample.sh file for anyone out there who's interested to clone this project. But yeah, that is how we can upload the debug symbols. So let me run this on the simulator. There we go, build succeeded. And I don't have notifications turned on, but you can see that we have notifications here. That means that everything is set up correctly and the debug symbols are uploaded. If we scroll down here, we can see that everything is correct and everything is initialized, so there's nothing to worry about. There we go. Right now, Sentry has the debug symbols of this run, and when errors happen in this run, Sentry is gonna know how to point us to the right direction and give us all of the info we need to figure out what the issue is. Okay, so that is how we can, that's how we can upload the debug symbols without actually leaking our authentication token. Really important. So next up we have using environment variables in iOS, and there are two phases. This is the first phase, or like this is the first way of loading the environment variables, but this happens at build time, right? So for example, in our case, if we run the build script, we're going to export these environment variables on the build time. But in order to initialize Sentry's SDK, we do need other environment variables for the runtime. So when the app actually runs on the phone, we need to obtain those values, pass them to the Sentry SDK, and set everything up and initialize them. So how do we do that? These are called runtime variables, right? We do that by creating configuration files. So for example, I created a new folder right here, just like a new group, named that configs, but I already did that, so I'm just going to delete this new folder. Hey G, how's it going? So I created the configs, and then inside I created a configuration settings file. Right, this is a key value file for all Xcode projects, I think. And I've also provided an example on how it should look like. So these are other Sentry environment variables. This is the DSN, the environment, the traces sample rate, and the profiling sample rate, right? And depending on whether your scheme is development or production, right? This scheme at the top, right there. You can have the debug and release and have specific values for your environment variables, depending on if you're debugging or releasing the app, right? So there are a few things that you need to also check out. Is the first line right here. When we have, and this is not just for Sentry, for any Xcode project that uses the CocoaPods integration, right? When we installed, for example, the Sentry SDK, we installed it through CocoaPods, and that changed our project structure a bit, right? So we got introduced with a new project called Goodbye Money, but then we also had the Pods project, right? And inside there is an important two files that we need to see. First one is this is the pods-goodbyemoney.debug file, and this is again configuration file, just like the ones we created. But these are really important because if we don't add, or like if we don't expose these variables, CocoaPods will not work. Any package that we've installed through CocoaPods also will not work. So it's pretty important to have these like exported within our app at runtime. And if I add, if I add something here, let's say hello equals world, right? Let's say we add our environment variables here. This is not going to work because the next time that I do, let's see, we have the hello world here. I'm going to do pod install. There we go. No more hello world, because when you run the pods install script, all of these files get wiped and basically rewritten. So it's not safe to put them here. That's why we created new configuration files, and we actually include those files within our configuration file. So we are kind of extending on those files, but we also add our custom runtime variables here. And this is the example file. I'm still providing the example file in case anyone wants to clone and try it out. What you need to do here is pick either the debug or release in the include sentence right here, because we have two files right here. There's the debug and there's the release. We should either include one or the other, depending on the scheme or like the environment. And that's why I have the debug and release configuration files right here, but I'm not going to open them because they contain keys. And then we add, for example, the DSN. Now I've run into an issue in here when you're actually adding the values of these runtime variables and you have // I think it treats them as a comment. So if you have some URL and then let's say HTTPS and then you do the // and then you write, I don't know, nikoloflazar.com. When you try to get this variable, the value is going to be just HTTPS : and that's it. So you basically cannot have URLs here. I've seen a trick in this case where you can add a little execution. I think this is like execute or something like that. It's a function that's like empty and it returns nothing, but it breaks this // I'm not sure how to explain this, but it breaks this // symbol. I don't know. So it's not being treated as a comment, so you get the full URL. But I think this is worse. I think it's better if you just provide it like so. We still know that it's a website, right? We still know that it's a URL. So I've added Sentry's DSN right here without the protocol, right? Without the HTTPS. So just whatever your DSN is, .ingest.sentry.io, and then the other digits that are unique to your account and project. And then I am appending or like prepending the HTTPS when I'm actually pulling the environment variable and when we're actually about to use it in Thunder. Thank you for the follow. When we're actually going to use that to initialize the Sentry SDK. So that's why I also left a little tip right here in the example file so people don't get all mixed up, right? Then of course we pick either development or production. In the release it's going to be production. In the debug it's going to be development, right? Because it matters. For example, when you're tracking your I don't know, performance or issues or whatever it is, you have the notion of environments, right? For example, if we have encountered, if we truly want to see, how users are using our app, then we probably are going to pick the production environment because developers are working in the development environment, and we're going to see a lot of noise coming from the development environment, right? All sorts of bugs and crashes, but that doesn't mean that our users are experiencing them, right? It only means that our developers are figuring things out and they're building the app. So that is the environment that we're talking about here. And that's why it's important when we release the app, we actually change the environment, right? So the developers and the actual users should not be in the same environment. And of course, yeah, then we just export the traces sample rate. This is like 100% of all the transactions or like events are being captured and sent to Sentry. And also the profiles sample rate is pretty much the same, but pay attention, the profile sample rate is actually relative to the traces sample rate, right? So for example, if we have the, I don't know, if we have the traces sample rate to 0, no, actually not 300%, but like 0.3, and the profile sample rate set to 1.0, that means the profiles will be actually 0.3. Because those are relative to the traces. So, and we'll speak about them, you know, what the traces are and profiles are a bit later. But yeah, for now, this is the first thing that we want to do if we want to like figure things out in terms of environment variables, right? We have the configs here, which are also added to the git ignore, and I'll run this later. Actually, you know what? Let me just open that git ignore file right now. As we can see, we have all of the configs right here, the debug and the release, but then we also have the example config right here. That has like the exclamation mark before it. That means accept this, right? So ignore all of the configs that I have here because I have keys inside of those files, except for the example, because that's just like for example. So that's how we can set up the debug and release. And in order to use them, we should go to the project right here. We should go to the project, not the target in this case. And then we have the configurations. I'm not sure if you guys can see this, but yeah, let me know. We have the configurations right here, and for debug and release, we should actually get these inside. Not, yeah, I'm gonna set these to debug instead of the pod ones, because the debug and release actually refer to the CocoaPod ones. And that's how we can load these configurations. The other thing that we need to do is go to the targets and info and actually put these environment variables into our info.plist file, which gets bundled and sent into the bundle. And this one is pretty simple. It's a key value data structure. So we, for example, define the Sentry DSN. If you don't know how to add this, just right click anywhere. There's the add row functionality right here. And we'll just register the Sentry DSN, and again, the same name, but it has like a $sign and it's wrapped in a parenthesis. Same for the environment and the traces and profiles. So whatever environment variables that we have defined within these configuration files, we also need to expose them here, because this is where we have access from within our app, right? Not the configuration file or the, for example, .env files, just the info plists. So in order to obtain these files now, right, we need to go to the for example, the starting point of our app. That is the Goodbye Money app, for example, where the app gets initialized, and we call the Sentry SDK.starts. Inside, we need to set the DSN, the debug environment, traces sample rate, profiles, and any other options that we want to have included in our app. And this is where, using the bundle.main.info dictionary, and this is the info.plist file that I mentioned earlier, you don't actually see this file, but yeah, I think from Xcode 12 and then the newer versions than Xcode 12 are actually hiding the info.plist file. So this is that file that we're talking about. So if you go back here, we can see that we dip into the info dictionary file, and then we're getting this Sentry DSN variable, right? Which will go back to the to this file, and then it'll try to obtain the Sentry DSN. And since this is already part of the configuration. It's going to have the value and it's going to return the value into DSN. And remember, we said that we are going to avoid the protocol in this case because I think it's treating it like a comment, so it gets discarded. It discards the rest of the DSN, and you only end up with the HTTPS. So this is where we actually prepend the HTTPS, and we set that into the options. Same thing for the environment, right? And we also do a little calculation here, like a little comparison. For example, we have the environment that would be either development or production, and if that environment is development, like it equals to development, then debug is true, right? And when debug is true, we get these useful logs from Sentry, because yeah, this is how we know what happens, what gets sent to our Sentry account and dashboard, and if there's anything wrong, we'll see it here. But we don't want that for production, so we'll just enable that if the environment is development, right? And then we also append the environment here, so Sentry knows where to put those events and transactions. Then we have the traces sample rate, and these are obtained as a string because everything is a string into the info plist file. So we need to convert them to a double first and then wrap everything into an NS number, because that is what the traces sample rate type is. It is an NS number, so we need to convert the string into a double first and then the double to an NS number, because we can't cut corners in this case. And the same thing for the profiles, and then we enable some of the options that we want to be enabled, right? So for example, the app hang tracking, the user interaction tracing, we want to attach the view hierarchy, etc., etc., and that's it. This is the second part of the environment variables. So we are basically initializing the Sentry SDK or any other SDK for that matter, because yeah, you need keys or like URLs or IDs for other services like Sentry, and in order not to leak them, you need to put them in a different file and git ignore that file. And it's easier if you just hard code them, right? So you have to like isolate them into their own files, but that represents another dependency, because now we need to figure out how we can pull those values from that file and use them within our app. So I figured, let's actually get them into a config file, because that is native to Xcode. That's how apps work in Xcode. And then dip into the bundle and just obtain the values. But when we change something, and like when we want to push, these files are ignored by the source control. So that's why we're not actually able to leak those, right? We only push the example right here, which is, it reveals nothing that's linked to us. So that is how we also can use the environment variables on the runtime, not on the build time in Swift. And lastly, what I want to show you is how we can use, or like how we can implement custom instrumentation using Sentry. So if we open the utilities folder right here and we open the expenses utilities, we'll see the group expenses by date function. So this function gets called on the expenses screen. It gets all of the expenses, right? So these can be like hundreds, thousands. I'm not sure how much, like how often do you spend money? And what this function does is it loops through each and every one of them, and it puts them into a dictionary based on the day where the transaction happened, right? And after that, we also need to sort these, we need to sort sort the expenses so that the today and yesterday are like at first, and then we can, you know, order the spending, like, or the days based on like the descending. So if we open the app right here, you can see that the first section that we have is the today section. Then we have the yesterday section. And then we have, for example, 17th of September, 22nd of September, 2021, right, and so forth. And that is, yeah, that is basically what this sort function does. And in order to see how complicated or like how long this function would run, we can create a transaction, like a manual transaction using the Sentry SDK. We can just do that by typing Sentry SDK start transaction. We'll name it expenses, and then we'll do render expenses, for example, because this whole thing, right, takes care of how expenses are grouped and sorted. And then based on that transaction, we can start a child transaction, or like a child operation, which is going to be the group expenses. There's a little description: group expenses by date. There is the group span right here. We group all of the expenses, and then we do finish, right? So this will measure how long the grouping happens, and then we'll do the same for the sorting. We get the transaction, we start a child's, we spawn a new child, sort expenses in this case, with the description, then do the finish right here, and then finish the transaction, right? So what that does is creating these, for example, if we go to the performance tab, let me see if you can actually see this. I'm gonna zoom in just enough so you can make out what's on the screen. Or if we go into our Sentry dashboard and go to the performance, we'll pick, for example, our project right here, environments, or like what is the time range that we're interested in, and then we'll see those custom values right here at the bottom. If we click on them, we are going to see some info. So let's just focus on this block right here, right, and check it out. Here are like the users, and there's like two of them. One is my actual phone, the other one is the simulator that we've used a couple of times. And these are the suspects spans, right? We have the sort, the group, and the parent transaction called expenses right here. And if we see here, we are going to see how long the actual transaction happened, right? So for example, at 12:30 p.m. I did some testing, and there are values like P99, P95, P75, and P50, and these are like all different, right? We can see that there's like 6 milliseconds for the top three, and then 5 milliseconds for the bottom one. We have 2.98, we have 1 millisecond right here. And what these P values means is that, for example, it takes all of the events that are, that have happened at that certain point, and it takes the percentile. So this is like 100% of them. This is like 99, 95, 75, and 50%. It discards first. It basically sorts them based on the duration, right? It discards, for example, 50% of them, and then it takes the first one from the discarded. So that is like the 5 milliseconds in this case, right? If we cut this in half and take the first one, that's 5 milliseconds. That means the P50 for that point will be 5. And I'm not sure where that point is, but there we go. Actually, P50 equals 5 milliseconds, right? And for example, the P99, it's 6 milliseconds, it's more. Because if we see this list and remove like 99% of it, maybe that would be like the whole list, and take the first, like the first item or the first entry, that is 6 milliseconds, and that means P99 is 6 milliseconds, right? And this is pretty much for the 95 and 75 as well. So what this means is that if we're measuring performance, we can't say that the average performance is, I'm not sure, like let's say in this case the average performance is 5.5, right? Because the P99 and P50 are like 6 and 5, and then if you like cut down in the middle, the average is 5.5. But that means that they're like 5.5 is because there's at least like 1 6 millisecond, right? But what if that 6 millisecond one is actually one person in this world who has, I don't know, slow internet or a low performance device, etc., and he like their device or like their metrics are the worst, and we can't take that into consideration because it will make our like values look bad, right? And that's just one person in this world. So cutting down the like first getting them ordered from the worst to the fastest, like slowest to fastest, and then we split on the 50, 75, 90, 99 or 100%, and then we pick the first one based on those cuts. That would give us a better understanding of how our app works, right? Or like how fast our app is, or like in this case how fast the expenses are being calculated, right? We might have some person clocking it at like 100 milliseconds, but we're not going to see that person right here because we'll see that person, for example, that metric in the P100, because P100 means that is the worst case scenario, right? Give me the worst metric or like the worst measurement that happened within our app, and that is what the P values are. But yeah, this is how we can, let me go back here, this is how we can span different processes and measure anything that we want within our app using the Sentry SDK. And then Sentry takes care of the rest. We have the dashboard, we can see all of the, all of the measurements, all of the metrics that we care about. What else? There is a user misery index as well. That means how much users, or like how many users have waited more than the 4 times of the response time threshold. So by default, I think that's like 300 milliseconds. So how many users waited more than 1200 milliseconds in this case, or like more than a second, right? That is the user misery index. And yeah, if we implement all of these custom transactions or like custom measurements throughout our app, where we anticipate some heavy calculations or like fetching data or some heavy operations like that we need to measure, we can see them straight in our Sentry SDK. Yeah, so with that being said, I have nothing else to present for today. We set up the debug symbols and they're being uploaded every time we run the app. We've implemented the custom performance measurements for our unique functions. And then we touched on the environment variables in iOS. And also, of course, the git ignore file, because I think that is the most important thing. Don't leak your environment variables or API keys or tokens or whatever it is. And yeah, so I'm going to cut this stream short now because I have something important to do in a few minutes. But yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed the quick presentation and looking forward to hang out more next Tuesday. So take care everyone. Ciao ciao.